Chapter 10. Agnes. In the middle of February, Mr. Gibson made a surprise announcement. We were to have 3 new Eskimo pupils admitted in the middle of the school year because the mother, who was pregnant, had been found to be suffering from tuberculosis and must be brought into hospital, and the children were too young to be left alone when their father was out trapping. The eldest of the 3 was a 9-and-a-half-year-old girl named Agnes. She had had no education yet. It had been intended that she should enter the All Saints School the previous September, and her family had then come in their boat as far as Tuktoyaktuk so that she could join the pupils returning from there on the school boat at the end of August. But Agnes had had other ideas. When her father wished to take her to the mission boat, she refused to go. He went to the bow of his boat to get her, but she took a stick and resisted fiercely, and her mother wept. The husband, being an indulgent father, like most Eskimos, did not force her to go. The little boys were very young, only 4 and 5 years old, and I thought that Gwen, with her large class of young children, would have enough to cope with in teaching them. So I asked if Agnes, though a beginner, could be admitted to my intermediate class. This was an exciting professional challenge. How should I set about teaching the basic subjects to a 9-year-old who did not speak my language and had never been to school before, especially as I should have to do this incidentally, my own pupils being far ahead of her and needing a good deal of attention. When Agnes first came into the classroom, her chin was sunk onto her breast, and she would not look up at all. She was much too shy to speak to me. I put her in a desk beside the desks of Ivy and Eva, 2 other Eskimo girls, so that they could chat together. I spoke to her, but she made no response. I had no clue yet as to her intelligence. I did not have available any intelligence test which would have been valid in such a situation, since her experience of life to date was so far removed from anything in civilization. As I was giving out materials to the rest of the class, I put a desk blackboard and some colored chalks on her desk in passing, but she did not pick them up. When the others had settled down to work, I went to Agnes. I wrote a row of E's in cursive style along the board. Then I put a chalk into her hand and made signs for her to try to copy it. Talking slowly and encouragingly, she lifted her eyes to look at me without lifting her head, but made no attempt to write. I put my hand over hers and guided her hand while she wrote 3 E's. Then I left her and went to attend to some of the others. When I came back, I saw that she had completed the row. I smiled and said, "Good." Then I wrote 3 C's with my finger in the dust on the board, and she at once wrote with her chalk a row of C's with such ease and fluency that I assumed she had done it before. I asked Ivy to ask her if she had been to school in Tuk-Tuk. Ivy asked in Eskimo, and Agnes shook her head. I now wrote a row of A's, which she copied directly. At my request, Ivy asked Agnes if her mother had taught her. Agnes shook her head. I found out later that the mother herself did not speak English. I took a colored chalk, colored a few of the loops to the E's, and indicated that she should fill the board. While I was busy with the other children, she produced a pleasing pattern. Then after the morning break, she wrote a page full of letters in pencil. I wrote the first 3 letters on each line, guided her hand to ensure that she made the lines in the right direction, and after she had written a couple of letters, I let her finish the line on her own. She then colored the loops with crowns. Her work was neat and tastefully colored. I did not have time this first day to deal with number in the afternoons. We had more recreative lessons, art and literature, and so on, so it was not until the next morning that I was able to explore her understanding on this account. I was sitting at my desk, and I called Agnes. After I had called twice, she looked up at me. I beckoned, but she made no response. Her head drooped, so I said to Ivy, "Tell Agnes I want her to come out here." Ivy did so, and then said, "She's scared." "Scared," I said, "of what?" "She thinks you're going to beat her," Ivy replied. I went over and took Agnes by the hand and led her to the blackboard. She did not resist. I had some large glass marbles, and I put one of them on the ledge underneath the board, wrote the figure 1 on the blackboard, and said, "Agnes, 1." She whispered, "1." It was the first time I had heard her speak. I then put 2 marbles, wrote 2, and said, "2." She repeated it and continued counting in this way up to 10. I thought, surely this child has been to school before. It was not until I talked to Mr. Gibson afterwards that I learnt that both the native races used the English words for numerals. Agnes had probably had practice in counting pelts. I went on with my work with the other children, leaving Agnes to copy the figures which I had written on the board. She did so without any difficulty, except that she made the familiar mistake of writing the 7 back to front. I then wrote in pencil the numerals up to 5, repeating each figure 3 times at the beginning of the line, and leaving the rest of the line empty. She completed the lines without any help, and then repeated the whole thing and colored the page. Having found that Agnes had this familiarity with number, I decided not to waste any more time with oral work, but to go straight on to the textbook for the first year pupil. This was a workbook with illustrations, the answers to the questions being written directly into the book. The instructions had to be read from the book. On the first page, groups of 10 objects in rows were illustrated. 10 chairs, 10 houses, 10 apples, for instance, and the pupil was required to make backs on 6 chairs, make doors on 9 houses, color 7 apples red. I counted aloud the rows of backless chairs speaking slowly and distinctly, and pointing to each chair as I counted. I said, "Count them," and took her hand, pointing her finger at each one as we counted together. I read, "Make backs on 6 chairs," pointing to the words. I drew a back on 1 chair, saying 1. Then on another, saying 2. I said, "You do it. Make backs on 6 chairs." I drew a ring round the figure 6 and left her. When I came back, she had done it correctly. I said, "Good. Make doors on 9 houses." I drew a ring round the figure 9, drew a door on 1 house, and said, "You do it." She did so, and also made tails on 10 cats, and colored 7 apples red, and 6 balloons green. After the initial explanation from me, the next page of the number book contained no figures, but a number of rectangles containing groups of spots, and the pupil was required to write a figure showing the number of spots in the group. I indicated the first group of 2 spots, pointed as I counted them, and wrote, underneath the figure, 2. I pointed to the next group and said, "Count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Again, I stopped counting, and Agnes formed the words with her lips, but made no sound. I said, "That's right. 6, write it." She hung her head. I repeated, "Write it here." She still hung her head. I realized then that although she knew the names of the figures, she could not write them without a copy. I said, "Let's put all the numbers here," and I wrote at the top of the page the numerals 0 through 10. I counted these aloud, taking her hand and pointing to each one in turn. Then I returned to the group of spots. I said, "Count them. Show me." She pointed to the dots and counted up to 8. I said, "8, write it," and I pointed to the figure 8 at the top of the page. She wrote it. I said, indicating the next group, "How many dots here?" She counted to herself and said soundlessly, 9, I said, "Write it here." She hesitated, so I pointed to the figure 9 at the top of the page, and she wrote it. I said, "Now do the rest," and indicated the whole page. I left her, and by the time I returned, she had completed half the work correctly, except for the old mistake with the 7. I corrected this, and she went on to finish the page by herself. The next step was to combine numbers. I took Agnes out to the blackboard again with the big marbles. I put 1 marble on the ledge and said, "How many?" She replied soundlessly. All her speech was silent. 1. I put another some distance from it and said, "And 1, 1 and 1, moving it up to the other. Makes how many?" she replied. 2, I said. "Good. 1 and 1 makes 2. Say it." She said it after me. 1 and 1 make 2, and repeated similarly as I demonstrated. 2 and 1 make 3. 3 and 1 make 4. 4 and 1 make 5. 5 and 1 make 6. Each time I wrote the figures on the blackboard using the plus and equals signs. I then rubbed off what I had written, demonstrated with the marbles again. 1 and 1 make 2, and asked her to write it. she hung her head again. Thinking that she was perhaps baffled by the arithmetical signs I wrote in her book. 2 plus 1 equals 3, 3 plus 1 equals 4, 4 plus 1 equals 5, 5 plus 1 equals 6. Repeating 2 and 1 make 3, etc. each time. I left her to arrange the marbles herself and write the combinations, but she sat without moving, head sunk. I came back and arranged the marbles for her, speaking cheerfully and asking her, 1 and 1, write it. Make how many? Yes, 2, write it, pointing to the figures I had written. The next day I tried again. I put 3 marbles in one box, and 1 in another. I said, 3 and 1 make 4, write it. She sat with head bent. I said, come along, write it. 3 and 1 make 4. She made no attempt to write. I took her hand, intending to help her, but perhaps sensing my irritation, she stiffened, resisting. I left her for a moment to attend to one of the other children, and when I returned, I said again, 3 and 1 make 4, and I took her hand. Again she resisted. I could not diagnose her difficulty. I said firmly but cheerfully, let's write it here. 3 and 1 make 4, and I took the marbles again and showed her. For several days, Agnes was held up by this step. I realized that I had missed a link somewhere, but I could not put my finger on it. I tried writing the combinations with spots instead of numerals, to no avail, so I decided to go on to the next page and hope enlightenment would dawn later. On the new page I found the same problem was presented differently. The combinations were placed vertically instead of horizontally. I took 4 marbles in one hand and 1 in the other. I said, indicating my left hand, how many? She replied 1. I nodded and went on, indicating the other hand, and how many? 4. Makes how many? 5. I said, good, write it. She wrote the answer at once in the appropriate place. I did 2 more sums with her, and then gave her the marbles and said, do them all. She did them all correctly, quite quickly, without using the marbles. The next process to be taught involved subtraction. I did not want to confuse her by introducing her to the takeaway jargon, so I began by using the same method as before. She was required to take 4 away from 5, so I put 5 marbles into the box, took out 4, and said, how many? She replied, 4 and 1. I said, pointing to the 1 in the box, makes 5. I repeated, 4 and 1 makes 5, writing the figure 1 in the line as I said it. I asked her to count the marbles again, and when she had counted up to 5, I took out 3 of them and said, 3 and how many makes 5? She promptly said 2. Write it, I said. Do them all. She did 5 more sums by herself, using the marbles to help her. She worked steadily through the book. When new items were introduced, I had only to read the key words and give her the idea, and she could be left to finish the page by herself. She had completed the year's work before the end of June. On her first day at school, Agnes had surprised me by her facility in the use of writing materials. I had had plenty of experience in England of the pupil who at the age of 9 or 10, and after 3 or 4 years of schooling, was unable to produce a neatly written page. I had expected that this daughter of the Arctic would find it very difficult to manipulate a pencil or pen, and that the process of learning how to read and write would be a slow one. I was pleasantly disillusioned. I found that I could teach reading and writing, not merely handwriting, but writing to say something concurrently. I began with her name, writing Agnes 3 times across the page, and saying Agnes each time. Then I pointed to her and said Agnes, and pointed to the word. I dealt in a similar way with Ivy and Eva, pointing to her neighbors. I held her hand while she wrote Agnes twice, then left her to finish the page by herself. The next morning I wrote, Agnes is a girl, held her hand while she copied it once, and then left her to fill the page with it. She had no difficulty. She copied on her blackboard rows of patterns, first using the letters, which had no loops or tails, A, C, E, I, O, U, M, N, etc., then B, H, L, etc., with tails above the line, and G, Y, P, etc., with tails below the line. When making the letter for her to copy, I always said its name, but I did not bother her to repeat it. Then I put the letters together consecutively in threes, A, B, C, D, E, F, etc. I did not set out to teach her the alphabet, but I knew I could not teach her composition unless she knew the names of the letters. When she asked how to spell a word, in a very short time I was able to write for her to copy a sentence every day about something that interested her. I would ask her, through Ivy or Eva, what she would like to tell me today, and she would reply with a sentence which, when translated by one of the girls, would say, I have a new baby brother, or we went to church yesterday, or soon we shall pick berries. She would copy this very neatly all down the page, and make colored patterns round the letters. I was able to give some time individually to Agnes after break each morning, when I had a smaller class. She would stand beside me while I talked about the pictures in a book, with the aim of encouraging her to want to read. I began with an old copy of a book called Joe and Ruth. I pointed to the picture of the boy, saying Joe, then of the girl, saying Ruth. Then I pointed to herself, saying Agnes. I said again, Joe, say Joe. She lifted her eyes to look at me. I said, say Joe. She made the shape of the word with her mouth, but silently I said, good, Ruth. And she formed Ruth. I said, Joe is a boy, Ruth is a girl, Agnes is a girl, Tommy, pointing to him, is a boy. Say, Tommy is a boy. But she said nothing. The next day, I began to read the text to her. I would read the words, point to the object in the picture, repeat the word, and then say any other associated words. For instance, Joe put on his cap. I put on an imaginary cap. I pointed to the cap in the picture and said, cap, say cap. Following up with shirt, dress, shoes, pointing to each in the picture, and then in reality, I pointed to the word again and said cap, say cap. Agnes formed the word cap. I read the line and she repeated it word by word. In time we came to the book, Joe and Ruth Go to School. I chatted to her about the pictures, and though she could not have understood the words I used, she was very quick to get the sense. As I read, I moved my finger along the line of words, from time to time, emphasizing a word, by associating it with something which was familiar to her. Then, the next time the word appeared, I would wait for her to say it first. Some words she learnt quickly: little, school, dinner, come, and the names of the children, Joe and Ruth. She found difficulty with the name of the pony, Darky. She had never seen a horse, and with ran, run, away, she frowned at get and girl, so I wrote these words on the board in cursive writing and explained the difference between the printed and the written G. After this, I always gave a brief explanation if the printed letter differed from the writing she used in her exercise book. When we came to the word ears, I pointed to my ears, saying the word, and then to hers, and asked her to say it. I pointed to the other facial features in the same way, also writing each word on the board. When we came to nose, she pointed to her nose with a smile. After I had read the whole book to her in this way, we turned back to the beginning, and I began again more slowly. Agnes was now much more free in her response, but her speech was still entirely inaudible. She formed the words only with her lips, and I had to watch her mouth closely to interpret. However, she advanced so rapidly that I decided to start on the prescribed reading primers. We look and see, we work and play, we come and go. It was on May 14th, allowing for the Easter holiday, which had intervened. Agnes had been in school only 10 weeks. That I presented her with the book, We Look and See. I realized that a number of the words would be outside the vocabulary she had acquired so far, and as we came to each unfamiliar word, I would repeat it 2 or 3 times. She found it difficult to remember the word Spot, which was the name of the dog. I wrote an S on the board and drew a picture of a kettle with an S-shaped plume of steam coming from it, and made a hissing sound. After that, for a time, she would hesitate when she came to the word Spot, and make the sound of the initial consonant, before recognizing the whole word. On this day, I was able to devote about half an hour to Agnes, during which time she read through the whole book, taking the new words in her stride, and being able to recognize them without prompting after the second or third repetition. It did not take me long to decide that this little Eskimo girl had intelligence of unexpected quality. Then Mr. Gibson told me something of her background. Her grandfather had been a Danish trader who had come north with the explorer Stephenson, stayed on the coast, and married an Eskimo wife. Agnes was the daughter of one of his sons. Chapter 11. The Promise of Spring. A month or 2 before my own arrival in Aklavik, there had been a ceremonial opening of the new territorial day school. Up to that time, education in the Mackenzie district of the Northwest Territories had always been the charge of the church, with government supervision of the secular subjects of the curriculum. Now, state education had been introduced, and a woman teacher from Eastern Canada had been appointed principal. Apparently, her arrival had caused something of a sensation. She had stepped from the plane with the aplomb of a film star, her slender but full-bosomed figure shrouded in a crimson coat with deep collar of silver fox fur, and her chestnut curls peeping provocatively from under a floppy, wide-brimmed black hat. It was not merely a sense of adventure which had brought her to the north. She had a family to support, and this post carried a very attractive salary. She had, moreover, a compelling personality, and there was some alarm, at least among the wives of the community, when she announced that she had come north to emulate the Mounties, who always got their man. She was soon a popular figure around town, addressed by all and sundry as Gloria, but I had to make some adjustments to my conception of the attributes of a head-mistress. One wintry afternoon, when I had a half-day off duty, I found my way to the government block, in the middle of the town, where Gloria had an upstairs apartment. She received me with joy, and we had a long professional gossip on such subjects as the different methods of teaching reading, and the character of the native child. From professional matters, we went on to personal ones. It was some time since Roger Wilton had called at the mission. Gloria knew him only by report, and was anxious to meet him in person. The upshot was that we decided that on my next day off duty, we would go exploring and see if we could find Roger at home. On the day appointed, we set out along the river bank, in the direction away from the settlement. In time we came to a stretch of snow-covered ground, which it was apparent had at some time been cleared of bush. This was the remains of a site which had been intended for an airport during the war. At this time of year, the ground looked reasonably suitable for a runway, but at the time of the thaw, the land becomes bog. After a bulldozer had been swallowed up by the bog in the early days, the idea of using the area had been abandoned. Here we found the coarse marsh grasses and sere willows to which Roger had once referred, but no rough and unprepossessing character came to meet us. Perhaps he was still out of town, at his winter wood-cutting camp, in the bush. We trudged on and on. Gloria was the first to sight the tent in the distance, a lonely habitation backing up to a clump of trees. There was no sign of life, no sled dogs staked among the willows, for instance, till a wisp of smoke from the chimney indicated that somebody might be at home. As we drew near to the tent, the door opened. "Hi there," Roger called to us. "Come on in." We entered, and I looked around me. The sides of the canvas tent were reinforced by wooden walls. In one of them was a door with wire gauze panels, through which you could see the trail. The gauze could be covered with a storm panel in bad weather. The floor was of wood, and there was a small cooking stove, with chimney pipe outlet through the canvas, a cupboard against the wall, and a folding shelf for a table. Against the opposite wall was a double-tiered sleeping bunk, with a bed roll on it. A couple of stools completed the furnishings. The woodwork was painted dark green, and everything was neatly stowed. Roger was very pleased to see us, and had soon brewed tea. We drank it out of tin mugs. Gloria began to prattle disarmingly, and I listened for a while. Then I found my thoughts drifting, and my imagination busy with the curtains and furnishings. To Roger, this shack was a home, and he seemed satisfied with it. Would he be content to live there forever? Loneliness, he had said in one of his letters, is a quite real and solid thing, which has been at my elbow for years. The worst manifestation of it is when there is no one with whom to share the beauty of the day, the comfort of the night, the happiness of one's heart. Marriage should be the expression of a deep inner union, a meeting and uniting of the spirit within our hearts. That was the point. If two people were to live together at such close quarters, there must be complete compatibility between them. One of the most important ingredients of happiness is harmony in human relationships. If this is lacking, not even the beauty of the surroundings can compensate for it. Roger had established his pattern of living. He withdrew from society, communing with nature, and working only when he needed to eat. He appeared to have no urge to acquire property or possessions, or to keep up with the Joneses. This did not seem to me now to be such an estimable characteristic as I had once accounted it. If he should have a wife to support and a family to educate, would he be able to make the necessary transition to a civilized way of life? It was getting late, and we had a long way to walk home. We must not linger. Roger escorted us for a while on our way back, and then waved to us till we were out of sight. There was a squally shower before we reached home. Afterwards, a display of rose-colored northern lights shimmered across patches of azure blue sky. I was sorry for the people who had been sitting watching movie pictures in the darkness of the cinema, unaware of the scene outside. Spring was approaching, and my anticipation of its advent was enhanced by the reading of my pupils' accounts of their summer activities. The girls described berry-picking expeditions, and the boys recounted fishing adventures, and their simple narratives painted for me a picture which I was anxious to bring to reality. My sister and I, wrote Emma Venlitzi, decided to go picking berries because it was such a beautiful day. She packed some lunch, and then we started off downriver. I paddled as hard as I could till we arrived at the berry patch. There were lots of berries. In about half an hour I picked 4 dippers full, and my sister, Winnie, picked 3 pails. Soon it was time to start a fire, so I brought some pieces of dry wood. When it was going small sparks went up in the air. We turned round to the lump of moss where we had set our plates, and found that some of our food was missing. We knew who did it. It was the Whiskey Jack. When we started back, the sun was setting slowly. The mountains seemed to be on fire. One morning I went to the nets with my father. We went down a swift current. I sat very still all the way, because if I had moved, the canoe might tip over. I had lots of fun watching the trees and the colored stones, and the seagulls sitting on the sand making all kinds of noise. When we arrived at our net, my father told me to get out of the canoe and stand on the shore. Suddenly we heard a growl. It was a grizzly bear, standing on top of a low hill beside some trees. I didn't move an inch, because it might dash forward and do me some harm. I saw his tracks, as big as man's. While it was eating some berries, my father took out his rifle and shot at it 2 or 3 times. Even then, it never died. It growled and turned away very slowly and disappeared behind a big bushy spruce tree. Mabel Andrews was 13 years old. She had been in hospital for some months undergoing treatment for TB. When we fish in the summer, wrote Mabel, my brothers and my father go to set nets, and my sisters and my mother put up the tent. That night, after my father visits the nets, he brings lots of fish up the hill, and we scale the fish. My mother cuts them up and hangs them on the stick. We make a fire under the fish to make it dry, and after that my father puts the dry fish in the fish camp. My sister and I hang the fish eggs on the stick and let them get dry. My mother and my sister go for blueberries. They pick lots of berries, and when they have filled the pail, we make a fire and cook dry fish and make tea and drink it. We pick cranberries, too, and we dig a hole in the ground and put a big pot of berries into it for use in the winter. William Knizzey wrote, we go fishing in the month of July. We set nets and we catch herring, grayling, jackfish, whitefish, crooked-backs, and connie. The biggest run of fish comes in August and lasts for 2 or 3 weeks, so that is the best chance we have. My father made a fish wheel to catch fish. The biggest catch was 1,300 herring, as well as other fish, during the season. Sometimes we have 6 or 7 nets and catch 600 or 700 fish a day. We cut the fish and dry it. What we cannot handle we save for dog feed. Last year, at our fishing camp, one day we went upstream for logs. We were about 4 or 5 miles away from our camp, and near the top of a hill I saw a big black bear moving around in the willows. John was in the canoe. He had a rifle. He took a shot but missed, and the bear started to run up the hill. We did not see it again. The next night, about 9 o'clock, we went up to hunt bear about 4 miles from our camp. We were watching for almost 2 hours. Then we decided to go home. Just as I cranked the kicker, John told us there was a bear. I stopped cranking and we paddled across very quietly. The bear was walking slowly on the sandbar. Suddenly he put his head in the air as if he was smelling something. John shot at the bear, but he missed it. The summer interest of the Eskimo children concerned also whaling and the reindeer roundup. William Allen wrote, my father and the other men go whaling in the Arctic Ocean. We see whales jumping in the air and diving in the water. The little ones are gray, and they jump the most. The mothers just come up to breathe. Once we went whaling. My father was shooting the whale. It was shot in the head twice. It started to go mad. It went under the boat and hit the front of it. My father shot it again in the back. It sank to the bottom. The water was shallow. We looked for an hour. Finally, my father found it and threw the harpoon into it. On the way home, I went to sleep. When I woke up, we were at the shore, and the whale was pulled up. The women cut up the whale and wash the whale's skins and hang them up to dry. They divide the pieces of meat in 3 and put them in big cans. Oil is taken from the blubber and put into barrels. The skin is used for shoes. Eve Oktok was picking berries near the reindeer camp when she went to the corral to watch the reindeer. I saw the little fawns, she wrote. They just played with each other. The big reindeer bull was behind the corral, and my dog went there. The bull started to chase Tony. Then it started to chase me. I got a stick, but the reindeer did not run away. Further along the shore, I saw a little fawn and his mother. His mother had died. I told my father, and he went to take the reindeer away. My mother cut the reindeer skin and hung it to dry. When we were on the hill, we saw a reindeer sleeping, and I went down the hill and woke him up. When he got up, he put his front feet down first, then the back legs, and went to his mother. Tony barked again, and the reindeer started to run. The Eskimos also hunted the muskrat. Jenny at Koskok wrote, I have been ratting with my brother for the last 3 weeks. He sits at the back of the canoe. I stay at the front. We have to look well when we are hunting, because some of the muskrats hide in their nests behind the willows. They make the nest with grass on top of wood. When the water is high after breakup, and when it is a nice day, some of them stay in their hole, and we have to call them. They make a sound like a little puppy's cry. Once I let the rat get really close to our canoe, and my brother shot it right on the head and killed it. When we were going through a narrow creek, we saw a bear track, and I was scared. After a while, we saw the bear, where she was lying. She gathered the leaves to lie on, and she broke the tree down. We heard her baby cry. When spring came at last, must I continue to be cooped up in the confined area of the mission buildings? I longed to be a more active part of my new surroundings, and I felt that I could make a more effective contribution to the educational development of the children if I were working independently. It was Gloria who gave me the key to a fuller life. She suggested that I should resign from my post as intermediate teacher in the mission with effect from the end of the school year and join her in running the government day school. This was a small, modern building. About 200 yards from the back of the All Saints School, equipped with up-to-date furniture, fluorescent lighting, oil-burning heating stoves, polished linoleum, and other amenities. Since there were now many white children in the Aklavik area, most of them the children of government officials, administrators and game wardens, and doctors and teachers who would be returning to civilization, After the tour of duty was over, the educational system must set out to fit them to reach the standards required in the cities to which they would return. The federal government had therefore opened a number of day schools throughout the Mackenzie district, and welfare teachers employed directly by Ottawa had been brought into the territories to run them. The Aklavik Federal Day School had opened the previous September with an expected enrollment of about 25 pupils, but by Christmas time the enrollment was over 50, with Gloria the only teacher struggling, not only with the teaching of this large group of children, white, native, and part native, and cut off by 5,000 miles from her source of supply of teaching materials and her education office at Ottawa, but also with the domestic chores in her apartment. She had a small son with her, for whom meals must be prepared, and on top of all this, she was also trying to organize evening classes for the young adult population. This would have been a formidable task, even for a man who had a wife to care for his domestic comfort, but a woman was expected to cope with the whole thing. The Canadian government was enlightened enough to pay equal rates to men and women teachers. Gloria had made a desperate appeal to the authorities for an additional teacher, but as yet none had been appointed. If my application for the post was accepted, this would be a wonderful solution to my problem of getting out and about, and since I was committed to serve in the mission for 1 year only, it would not involve the breaking of any contract. In the middle of February, the superintendent of education for the Mackenzie district flew in from Ottawa to visit all the schools in Aklavik. I'd been nervous about this visit, but when he came, I found that he was a graduate of a British university, and he had the same outlook on education as my own. I discussed with him the question of my transfer to the day school, and he said he would be pleased to recommend it. I sent in my application for the new post forthwith, and was appointed with effect from the 1st of September following. Chapter 12. Trapping. Easter brought me waves of homesickness. It was the custom for the Bishop of the Arctic, touring his huge diocese by plane at this time of the year, to preach in the pro-cathedral at Aklavik on Easter Sunday. On the way to church, as I followed my 50 or 60 Indian children in their best navy blue parkas and scarlet berets, I marveled to realize that I was here on the top of the world, so far away from my friends. The sun shone dazzlingly on the snow, and I was wearing the darkest glasses I could get. In West Malvern Church, the moss-lined window sills would be deep in primroses, wild daffodils, pussy willow, and flowering currant, while here in Aklavik sub-zero temperatures still prevailed, 40 below at breakfast time, rising to 10 below by noon, but at least we had sunshine, whereas in England there was probably fog or drizzle and a fuel shortage. There were already long hours of this sunshine. It would be light when I awoke, around 6:30 a.m., and the daylight would continue till 9 o'clock at night. We were halfway to church when we heard the hum of an engine, and looked up to see a little red plane buzzing out of the blue. The children waved as the bishop's plane passed overhead, then banked and sailed out to land on the Pakiak Channel and taxi up to the shore. At this time of the year, the town was almost empty. The season for trapping muskrat opened on the 1st of March, and the local families had all gone out by dog team or plane to their camps in the bush. So the Indian and Eskimo church services were sparsely attended, but at the English service at night the cathedral was packed, and after the service there was such a big crowd for coffee in the hospital sitting room that we had difficulty in fitting in all the guests. There was a hum of conversation. The main topic concerned the activities of a local man who had been out into the wilds prospecting on behalf of a group of people in the town. He had returned with samples of rock containing a rich quantity of gold or some more precious ore. The samples had been sent outside to be assayed, and everyone was getting ready to make a dash out into the hinterland to stake a claim if the report proved favorable. Then a portable screen was put up, and the bishop showed colored slides of his recent tour of the eastern Canadian Arctic, and I got a further glimpse into the work being done in the Arctic by the Anglican Church. The Easter holiday was merely a period of respite from teaching. We still had the children to look after, and as the supervisors also needed a rest, the teachers took over some of their duties. But at least there was some freedom from the restrictions of a timetable, and taking the children for a walk now was a pleasure and not an ordeal, as it had been at Christmas time. In the afternoons, some of the Indian children would be fetched by their friends or relatives in the town to spend a few hours in home surroundings. Most of the Eskimo parents were out of town trapping. The trapping of muskrat was restricted to certain months of the year in order to conserve the species. Fur had been the chief economic resource of the Mackenzie district since the time of Alexander Mackenzie himself, and even in his day it had been realized that indiscriminate trapping might lead to extermination of species. The first steps toward conservation were taken by the fur traders themselves in their own interest. In 1825, for instance, Indians were discouraged from hunting beaver during the summer, and in 1830 the catch for certain districts was restricted to the average 4 preceding years. In 1839, only large muskrat were accepted, and at some posts certain furs were refused over a period until their numbers increased locally. It must have been difficult to persuade the trapper who wanted to sell his furs now that the trader's refusal to buy was in the general interest. The children told me all about the muskrat, whose fur is used in the making of musquash coats. It is not really a rat at all, but an aquatic animal, with hind feet partly webbed and a fine, dense fur. It builds a domed house of vegetation mixed with mud 3 to 5 feet high in a marsh or shallow lake, with the entrance underwater. Above water, the muskrat chews out 1 or 2 rooms. It feeds on waterweed, crayfish, and clams from the lake. in summer building a feeding platform of floating vegetation, and in winter keeping a breathing hole open in the ice and scooping out a shelf on which it can sit to eat its weed. These holes become roofed with soft fallen snow so that the frozen lake looks as if it is dotted with snow-covered mole hills. These are called push-ups or rat camps. I was much intrigued to find trapping as a subject of the curriculum on my timetable. This would be an occasion when the pupils would instruct the teacher, and I was as much excited as the children were when Mr. Gibson announced that the school trapping would begin after the Easter holiday. The school had its own registered trap line consisting of a number of lakes on the far side of the river. The boys who were allowed to use the school dogs and toboggan for transportation had the 3 more distant lakes, and the older girls were split up into groups of 8 or 9 each, in charge of different members of the staff. It was necessary for the subject to be admitted to the school timetable for the simple reason that the children, being resident in the school during the months of the open season, missed the chance of learning the traditional skills from their parents. The fur traders had discovered that these skills can be permanently lost in a very short time, and in the interest of the fur trade, they urged the government to include trapping as a school subject. Lessons started early in the afternoon of the first Wednesday in April, finishing by 3 o'clock. Then the trappers, hardly waiting to swallow the cookies which must sustain them until supper time, put on their warmest garments. The matron lent me a fur-lined parka to supplement the feeble protection of my ski suit, and I hurried to join my group. Each girl carried 2 steel traps and a scoop made by nailing an empty tin onto the end of a stick, and there were 2 little axes to be shared among the party. We crossed the river directly opposite the mission grounds, below the town site. Now and again a hail from behind would give warning of the approach of a dog team, and we all scattered to give them right of way. The dogs loped along with great joy apparent in the waving of their fringed tails and the lolling of their pink tongues. As they ran from time to time, one or other of them would snatch a mouthful of snow from the side of the trail. On the far bank of the river, we had to leave the trail, well packed by the passing of the toboggans, and make our way to the first lake. In 5 minutes, I was utterly exhausted. At every step, I had to lift my legs high to break into the depth of the snow, as the fall had been deep. In spite of the low temperature, I was sweltering inside my parka, puffing and panting and floundering. I struggled to keep up with the children, but at last I had to shout for someone to stay behind and show me the way. As soon as we came to the flat expanse of the lake, the children divided up in pairs and set off to walk across it, feeling with their feet for push-ups under the snow. Soon they were little black specks in the distance. At first I was worried, fearing they might get lost, but I gave up the attempt. scooped out a bed in the soft snow, as one does in the sand on the beach, and lay down to sunbathe. I was enveloped by silence. As I lay there, I was still unable to accept the reality of my present situation. If years earlier a crystal gazer had given me a glimpse of the future, now this present in which I found myself, I should have dismissed it as pure fantasy. How I wished I could transmit across space to my friends a picture of this moment, reproducing the vivid color contrast, the dazzling white of the snow, the brilliant blue of the sky above, in which floated one lonely black raven, the dark green of the snow-piled spruce trees. I sat up and looked across the lake. The girls in the nearest pair were kneeling down, and I went to see what they were doing. They had found a rat camp and were opening it up preparatory to inserting the trap. First, they removed with their hands, protected by mitts, the soft snow on top. Then they broke up the lumps of frozen snow with the axe. When the mound was opened, they scooped out the slush with their tin cans and felt for the shelf on which to put the trap. I saw now the reason for the mitt harness, which keeps the mitts from falling into the snow. The trap was opened and set in position. No bait was needed. Then the slush and snow must be carefully replaced to build the mound up again. If air spaces were left between the lumps, the water in the hole would freeze and the rat would not use the camp. The girls broke up frozen lumps of snow with their feet and piled the pieces on the mound, finally covering it all with handfuls of soft snow. A branch was stuck in the mound to identify the position in case of another snowfall, and the girls went on to set their next trap. The next day, we went back to collect the trapped animals. Now that the trail had once been broken, it was not such a struggle to wade through the snow, and we were soon on the lake. The girls split up into their pairs again and went hurrying to their traps. First, they kicked on the mound to discover whether they had caught a rat. If the animal was alive, it would move, and the chain, which secured the trap to the branch, would rattle. It was only when the rat was newly caught that this was likely to happen. Then the girl would know that she must open the push-up cautiously, as the muskrat has sharp teeth. When she drew out the trap with the animal attached to it, she would hit the victim on the head sharply with the back of the axe. But even so, before she could get in her blow, the muskrat might leap right up to her face. In most cases, however, the little beast was frozen stiff. The trap was reset, and the mound built up again. And at the end of the afternoon, we returned to school, triumphantly bearing 10 rats among the 7 girls. We went trapping in this way every school day for 3 weeks or more, and even when the temperature was well below zero, the outing was enjoyable. In the evenings, after the rats had thawed out, they were skinned by the young trappers and put on stretchers in the furnace room to dry. Next day, the oven was full of roasting carcasses. The owners of these were envied. When on invitation I tasted the meat, I was surprised to find it as delectable as roast chicken. The dried skins were taken on Saturday afternoon to the Hudson's Bay Company store, where the manager paid the current rate for them. Some of the children had $10 or more from the sale of their pelts. I noticed that the boys spent their money on toy aeroplanes and such trifles, while the girls invested in check shirts in the style worn by the cowgirl movie heroines whose pin-up pictures adorned the lockers in their dormitories. The riverbank was soon humming with activity. Boats which had stood in stark ranks above the waterline throughout the winter were now undergoing rejuvenation treatment, and the men were busy caulking and painting and tinkering with engines. All day long, Roger Wilton worked on his substantial boat within sight of the school windows, and would drop in the evenings, sometimes for relaxation. If he did not feel sociably inclined, he would spend hours studying the volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica which he found in Mr. Gibson's study.